Let me take you back in time again, but not the 75 years to VE Day. We'll split the difference and go back 39 years to 1981 and a much younger version of myself. And it's spring 1981 and it's just after the MAYC weekend. For those of you not familiar with old Methodist terminology, Methodist Association of Youth Clubs, MAYC. And that was the year that I appeared on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall performing as a frog. But that's a story for another time. And that was the year that we had a party of young people from Barnsley sleeping on our church hall floor, because the church I went to then was in South London. And one of them casually said, "Well, why don't you come up and see us sometime?" And not long after that I was at a party with my friend Mark, who also was attached to the same church. And sometime in the middle of that party it seemed like a good idea to drive up to Barnsley, as you do from South London in the middle of the night. I think I must have very understanding parents, because we went home, knocked on my door, grabbed a few things and off we drove. It would have been an American car, because Mark had a penchant for old American cars, being a mechanic who could do them up himself. Now, why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this story because I hadn't got the first idea how to get to Barnsley. If you'd said to me, "What's the way?" I'd have said, "Well, I don't know the way." But I didn't need to know the way. I just needed to trust that the driver of my car, Mark, he knew how to get there. And in truth, for some, maybe most of that journey, my memory fails me, I was probably asleep in the car. I didn't need to know the way. And he almost got us to our destination. At 6 o'clock in the morning we turned up at the police station in the middle of Barnsley, and all he could remember was that the address of the church was Barnsley Road. So we turned up at the police station as naive 19-year-olds and said, "Can you tell us where Barnsley Road is?" And the police officer looked at us and said, "Do you want Barnsley Road Cudworth, Barnsley Road Dodworth?" and then reeled off a list of several other villages around the Barnsley area, all of which had Barnsley roads. Of course, the one place that didn't have a Barnsley Road was Barnsley itself. But we found the church that we were looking for by trial and error, looking at notice boards until we recognised the name of the minister. I'll come back to that story later on. But Jesus says, "You know the way to the place where I am going." And we might picture from that a road stretching out Pilgrim's Progress style, and the temptations to deviate from the way on either side, leading to a narrow gate at the end of the journey. And that's undoubtedly what's behind Thomas's question when he says we don't know the way. He's picturing something like that. But Jesus also says, "I will take you to where I am." We do not need to know the way. Jesus wasn't saying, "I'm going to tell you about the way, you've got to find it, you've got to navigate your way there, and when you get to the end, you'll come to my Father's house." Jesus says, "I will take you to where I am, to where the Father is." Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. So are we saying, when Jesus talks about the way to the Father's house, that he's not saying that we've got to find the way and we've got to navigate it and find our way there, but he's saying that he will take us from A to B. He will be our guide. Well, yes, we are, but we can make it sound like my friend Mark driving me somewhere, giving me a lift. And what Jesus is talking about is so much more than that. And to draw out the glorious truth, I want to say something that will probably be familiar to anyone listening from Bicester Methodist Church, because I've mentioned it quite a few times before, but it doesn't lose anything from being repeated. And I want to give you a brief introduction to Jewish marriage customs at the time of Jesus, because marriages usually were pre-arranged between families. And it started with a bride being chosen. The family would decide on a suitable bride for their son. And that would usually be the father's choice because the father was head of the household. And then the son would leave the father's house and go to see his bride so that he could decide for himself that this was the girl that he wanted to marry. And they would enter into a covenant contract, the betrothal. And usually this was more important than the wedding itself. It's almost that was when the marriage started. It was way more than our engagements, which sometimes can be fairly flimsy, and engagements can be broken off quite easily. To put it bluntly, this was the point at which the goods were bought and sold. And that when we come to the marriage later, it's simply a case of when the buyer is going to come back and arrange collection. Fourthly, there was a price to be paid. Today we speak more in terms of a dowry that the bride's family pay. But in those days, the groom's family paid a price to compensate the bride's family for the loss of their daughter. And when all that was settled, the groom would come back to his father's house. And there would be a period of separation. A period not less than 9 months to ensure that, well, let's just again put it bluntly and crudely, that the bride wasn't pregnant by some other man. But it could be as long as 2 years or so. And in that time, the groom would be preparing space, preparing room in his father's house, maybe customizing some of the existing space, or maybe building an extension onto the side of the house. A place that would be his living quarters with his new wife when that time came. And finally, the groom would come back from his father's house to pick up his bride and the bridal party and bring them back to the father's house for a full-scale celebration and marriage ceremony. As I have outlined that for you, have you begun to see what Jesus is really talking about in this passage? He's using the language of marriage when he talks about the Father's choice. You are the beloved. You are the Father's choice. You are the one that the Father has picked out to be the bride of his Son. And together, collectively, as the church, we too are the bride of Christ. An analogy that the writer to the Ephesians uses in chapter 5. We are the bride of Christ. You are chosen. You are loved by the Father. And the Son is sent into our world. He's sent to enter into that covenant with us, that covenant that is sealed with his blood and his body, with wine and with bread. The price is paid, the price that Jesus paid with his death upon the cross. And now we come to that point where the Son is going back to the Father's house. And he uses these words to his disciples and to us. He says, I'm going back, but I will return. I'm going back to prepare a room for you. But I will return, and I will take you to be where I am. Jesus, who, if anyone entered into a commitment, anyone entered into a covenant promise, Jesus will be the most faithful in keeping it. Jesus says, and one day you will come to be with me. And I want to finish by going back to where that passage started. It said, believe in God, believe also in me. I think the NIV translates it as You believe in God, believe also in me. But I prefer the translation, believe in God, believe in me. And what those verbs mean, where it says believe, it really means trust, have faith. Don't stop believing in me. Because of everything that the disciples are going to go through, the turmoil that they're in, he says don't be afraid. People are talking about betraying. People are talking about disowning. Jesus is talking about being taken away from them to a place where they cannot go. They're in turmoil, and that will only get worse. But there'll also come that time on the other side of Easter where they're waiting for Jesus to come again. They're waiting, they're waiting, they're waiting. And it doesn't come as they expect in their lifetime. Jesus says, don't stop believing. Keep having faith. And he would say the same to you as well. Know that you are loved. Know that you are chosen. Know that Jesus has come into this world to enter into a covenant agreement with you and with his church. He will never let us down. And he promises that one day he will come back and take you to be where he is, in his Father's house. A very big thank you to everyone who contributed their pictures showing some of the themes that we've spoken about so far. That way to the Father, Jesus being the way that gets us there perfectly, not like my friend Mark who almost got us there but then had us looking around every village around the Barnsley area. Looking at the idea of trust and trusting in God and trusting also in Jesus. But also picking up on the idea of the Father's house. In John we looked at the idea of the Father's house as somewhere that Jesus takes us. Somewhere for the future, somewhere where we go from earth to heaven. But in Peter we have the idea of the Father's house actually coming down from heaven to earth in the now, in the presence, in the we who are the living stones, who by the power of the Holy Spirit are being built together into what it says a spiritual house, a spiritual building where Jesus is either the cornerstone or capstone, depending on how you choose to translate that word, but whichever way, a vital piece of the architecture. And when Peter talks about a spiritual house, he's making no less a comparison than with the temple in Jerusalem. That spiritual house that was there, that was the dwelling place of God. Peter is daring to say that as we are built up by the Holy Spirit, we become the dwelling place of God. We become our Father's house, or at least an extension of our Father's house by the Spirit, built in the here and the now. Let me take you back to that story we left off, Mark and myself in Barnsley, or close to Barnsley, in the early morning. And imagine if you're the minister of that church's notice board that we are stood in front of, being rung up at 8:30 on a Sunday morning by two people that you probably barely remember. But we were welcomed like long lost friends. The rabbis of old said that Abraham's tent had its flaps open on all four sides so that he could welcome strangers, and that was certainly what we experienced. We were welcomed into the family, we were fed, we were watered, we were given a bed for the night, we were taken to church, we were taken to the youth meeting that Sunday evening, and we were taken to the Cliff College Festival the following day, the Monday, or the bank holiday Monday. We experienced the presence of God in another human being. And Peter says that is what each one of us can offer to the world. It might not be hospitality for you, but it will be something that God empowers you by his Holy Spirit to do. In another it will be hospitality. In another it will be this, in another it will be that, but we're being built together into that spiritual house where God's presence and God's power can be experienced by those people around us.